The 4-year-old girl's frozen handprints were still pressed against the metal door when Grace found them, small, desperate marks left by fingers that had clawed for help until they couldn't move anymore. By then, it was almost too late. But what broke Grace's heart wasn't the handprints themselves. It was that nobody had been close enough to hear the children screaming. Robert Chen stood alone in his glass-walled office on the 3rd floor of his Connecticut estate, staring at a city skyline he owned pieces of but no longer saw. At 45, his reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows showed a man who looked successful by every measure that mattered to the world, and empty by every measure that mattered to the soul. His company was worth $3.2 billion. His art collection could fund a small nation. His name was engraved on hospital wings and university buildings. But when he closed his eyes, all he saw was his wife's face in those final moments, and all he felt was the weight of everything he'd failed to say before she was gone. Have you ever lost someone so suddenly that your brain refused to accept it? That's where Robert had lived for 18 months, in the suffocating space between denial and devastation. Subscribe now, because what happens when grief turns a father into a ghost will change how you see wealth forever. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. We want to know this story is reaching people who understand that some losses can't be measured in dollars. It happened in the driveway on a Tuesday morning. One moment, Catherine was laughing, keys in hand, turning to wave at Emma and Tyler watching from the living room window. The next, she collapsed, a brain aneurysm, sudden and absolute. Robert held her while paramedics worked frantically around him. Emma was 3 years old. Tyler had just turned 4. They watched through the glass as their mother died in their father's arms, and something in Robert died with her. He couldn't look at his children after that. Emma had Catherine's green eyes, the same shade, the same shape, the same way of looking at him like she could see straight through to his broken parts. Tyler had her laugh, that bright, unrestrained sound that used to fill the house. Every time Robert heard it, grief crushed the oxygen from his lungs. So he stopped being in rooms where he might hear it. He stopped being home at all. The numbers were clinical: 320 days traveling per year. 16 different countries. 42 business deals closed. 2 children who stopped asking when Daddy would come home because they learned that hope hurts more than acceptance. Robert told himself he was building their future, securing their inheritance, making sure they'd never want for anything. The truth was simpler and more devastating. He was running from the ghost of a woman he'd loved and the living reminders of everything he'd lost. The staff noticed. The nannies rotated every 3 months because they couldn't bear watching children fade. The tutors reported that Emma had stopped speaking in complete sentences at preschool. The night nurse documented that Tyler woke screaming from nightmares 5 nights out of 7, calling for his mother, then his father, then finally just crying alone in the dark until exhaustion pulled him back under. Robert received the reports. He signed the checks for therapists and specialists. He did everything except the one thing his children actually needed: he didn't come home. Grace Williams had worked for the Chen family for 12 years. She'd been there when Emma was born, when Tyler took his first steps, when Catherine used to dance in the kitchen while making pancakes on Sunday mornings. At 28, Grace was young to have seen so much heartbreak, but she'd lived enough to recognize the difference between grief and abandonment. Her own father had died when she was 9, cancer, slow and cruel, but her mother had held the family together with calloused hands and fierce love. Grace knew what it looked like when parents chose their children even when choosing was agony. And she knew what it looked like when they didn't. She watched Emma and Tyler become shadows of themselves. Emma, who used to narrate entire imaginary worlds while playing, now sat silent for hours holding her mother's old scarf. Tyler, who'd been fearless and laughing, now flinched at sudden sounds and asked Grace quiet questions like, "Did I make Daddy sad? Is that why he doesn't stay?" Grace held them when they cried. She read them bedtime stories Catherine used to read. She became the only constant in a house full of expensive things and absent love. Then came Victoria. Robert met her at a charity gala, one of those glittering events where wealth and tragedy mingled over champagne and silent auctions. Victoria Laurent was 34, white, elegant in a way that required both money and calculation. She had the kind of beauty that photographed well and the kind of sympathy that sounded rehearsed but felt convincing when you were desperate to believe someone understood your pain. She touched Robert's arm at exactly the right moment. She asked about his children with exactly the right tone. She made grief feel like something that could be managed, packaged, moved past. Within 6 months, Robert proposed. He told himself he was giving Emma and Tyler a mother figure, rebuilding the family they'd lost. He was so focused on the fantasy of restoration that he didn't notice Victoria's smile never reached her eyes when the children entered a room. He didn't see the way her fingers tightened on Emma's wrist when the little girl reached for her father. He didn't hear the edge in Victoria's voice behind closed doors when she thought no one was listening. Grace saw everything. Victoria moved into the estate like a conquering force. She redecorated Catherine's sitting room, donated Catherine's clothes, removed photographs from mantels and replaced them with modern art that meant nothing to anyone. She smiled for the cameras at Robert's charity events, played the role of devoted stepmother to be in public, and treated Emma and Tyler like obstacles in private. The cruelty started small. Sharp words when Robert was traveling. Locked bedroom doors during Victoria's social gatherings. Meals served to the children in the kitchen while Victoria entertained guests in the dining room. Grace tried to say something once, carefully, diplomatically, but Victoria's response was ice. Mind your place, Grace. You're the help. I'm going to be mistress of this house. Don't forget which one of us Mr. Chin chose. Emma stopped smiling entirely. Tyler developed a stutter. Grace documented everything in her mind, waiting for the right moment to tell Robert, hoping he'd notice on his own, praying the situation wouldn't escalate beyond words and isolation. But wealth has a way of insulating people from reality. Robert's world was conference calls and board meetings, private jets and hotel suites. His children's world was the same mansion he paid for but never stayed in. The distance between those worlds was measured in more than miles. 3 weeks before the freezer, Tyler asked Grace a question that still haunted her. If something bad happened, would anyone hear us? Grace had laughed it off, not understanding the weight behind those words. Not realizing he was asking because he already knew the answer. The night Robert announced his trip to London, Grace felt dread settle in her stomach like swallowed glass. 1 week. 7 days. Victoria's face when she heard the news. There was something in her expression that made Grace's hands shake while she folded laundry later that evening. Robert's car disappeared down the driveway at dawn. Victoria watched from the window, her reflection showing a smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with opportunity. Emma and Tyler sat at the breakfast table, pushing food around their plates. Tyler whispered to his sister, "It'll be okay. Grace is here." But Grace couldn't be everywhere. And Victoria had been patient long enough. That evening, when Emma's small hand accidentally knocked Victoria's champagne glass from the table, when crystal shattered across white marble and red wine spread like blood, Victoria's carefully maintained mask finally cracked. The rage that poured out was volcanic, disproportionate, terrifying. Tyler tried to step between them, tried to protect his sister the way no one had protected either of them. That only made it worse. "Maybe you need to learn what cold really feels like," Victoria hissed, grabbing both children by their arms hard enough to leave bruises that would still be visible days later. She dragged them toward the basement stairs while they cried and struggled. Grace was 2 floors up, putting away linens in the master suite, completely unaware that everything was about to change. The walk-in freezer in the basement was industrial-sized, designed for catering large events. It was kept at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Victoria shoved Emma and Tyler inside, Emma's cry cut off by the heavy steel door slamming shut. The lock clicked into place. Silence fell except for faint, muffled thumping from behind the door that would fade over the next 2 hours as small hands grew too cold to keep hitting metal. Victoria walked upstairs, poured herself another glass of champagne, and turned on music loud enough to cover any sound that might rise from below. Grace finished her duties at 9:30. The house felt wrong, too quiet in a way that prickled the back of her neck. She walked through the kitchen, noticed the shattered glass still on the dining room floor, noticed Victoria's half-empty bottle on the counter. She called for the children. No answer. Their bedrooms were empty, beds still made from the morning. Bathrooms empty. Playroom dark. Then she heard it. Faint. Rhythmic. Desperate. Coming from below. If you've ever been watching from somewhere that felt too cold, too empty, too far from help, drop a comment below and tell us where you are. Because what Grace found when she opened that freezer door will make you understand why some choices can't wait, and why love sometimes means risking everything, including the job that keeps you alive. Subscribe before the next chapter, because what happens when frozen children are pulled into warm arms will either restore your faith in humanity or break your heart completely. The basement stairs had never felt so long. Grace's hands were still trembling when she unlocked the freezer door. The sound that came from inside wasn't screaming anymore, it was something worse. Silence broken only by shallow, rapid breathing and the chattering of small teeth against bone. When the heavy steel door swung open, Emma and Tyler didn't run out. They tumbled forward like discarded dolls, their small bodies rigid from cold, lips the color of winter sky, fingers locked in positions they'd held while pounding metal until their hands stopped working. Grace caught Emma before she hit the concrete floor. The child's skin felt like touching ice through fabric. Tyler collapsed against Grace's legs, unable to stand, his whole body convulsing in violent shivers that looked like seizures. For 3 seconds that stretched into eternity, Grace's nurse training from community college kicked in, check airways, assess consciousness, prevent further heat loss. "I've got you," Grace whispered, though her voice cracked around the words. "You're safe now. I've got you." She stripped off her cardigan and wrapped it around Emma, then her jacket around Tyler. The basement was 68 degrees but felt tropical compared to the 28-degree prison they'd been locked in. Grace pulled both children against her chest, using her own body heat, rubbing their arms and backs the way the hypothermia protocols had taught her years ago. Emma's stuttered words came through frozen lips that barely moved. She, locked, we called, nobody came. The weight of those words hit Grace like physical force. These children had screamed for help while she'd been 2 floors up, folding linens, completely unaware that the people she'd sworn to protect were dying beneath her feet. Guilt was immediate and crushing, but there wasn't time for it now. Tyler's lips were still blue. Emma's shivers were too violent, too sustained. They needed warmth, medical attention, and protection from the woman who'd done this. Grace carried Tyler while Emma clung to her dress, climbing stairs that had never felt so steep. Each step was agony, not physical, but the kind that comes from understanding you're holding children who almost didn't survive the evening. Her mind was racing through impossible calculations, each one leading to dead ends and worse outcomes. Call 911. The ambulance would bring police. Police meant questions, investigations, photographers outside the gates, headlines that would follow Emma and Tyler for the rest of their lives. The children would be interviewed, examined, traumatized all over again by strangers with badges and cameras. Robert's face would be on every news channel, his billion-dollar empire dissected by reporters who didn't care about 2 small children, only about the spectacle of wealth gone wrong. Tell Robert. He was 7 hours ahead in London, probably asleep in some five-star hotel after a day of board meetings and business dinners. Unreachable until morning UK time. And even if she could reach him, what could he do from across an ocean except panic and blame himself for being absent when his children needed him most? Wait until Victoria left. The children needed warmth now. They needed to know they were safe now. And Victoria was upstairs entertaining guests, drinking champagne, laughing with friends while two children shivered in the basement from her deliberate cruelty. The kitchen fluorescent lights felt harsh after the basement darkness. Grace set Tyler carefully in a chair, his legs couldn't support him yet, and kept Emma wrapped in her arms. The little girl was still trying to speak, but her jaw wouldn't cooperate, her words coming out in fragments that broke Grace's heart. Tried, door. So dark, thought nobody. If you're watching this and your blood just went cold, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will show you the difference between a job and a calling. Grace pulled out her phone with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The screen showed 9:47 p.m. In London, it was 2:47 a.m. Robert would be asleep, probably had an early meeting, definitely wouldn't appreciate being woken by the help calling about the children. But his children were hypothermic in the kitchen while their father's fiancée drank champagne one floor above them, and Grace understood that some moments required risk. She dialed. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. Upstairs, the sound of Victoria's laughter drifted down through expensive floors, bright, performative, completely devoid of conscience. 4 rings. 5. Grace's breath caught in her throat. Answer. Please answer. Don't send me to voicemail. Don't make me leave a message that explains why 2 children almost died tonight. What? Robert's voice came through groggy, irritated, heavy with interrupted sleep. Grace? It's 3 in the morning here. This better be Mr. Chen. Grace's voice broke on his name, all the terror and rage and desperation of the past 20 minutes flooding out in 2 words. Your children. Victoria locked them in the basement freezer. They're alive but they're not okay. Their lips are blue. Emma can't talk. Tyler can't stand. You need to come home. Right now. The words hung in the space between Connecticut and London like smoke after a gunshot. For 2 seconds, 2 eternal, agonizing seconds, Robert's brain couldn't process what he'd heard. The individual words made sense. Strung together, they formed a sentence his mind rejected as impossible. Freezer. Victoria. The elegant woman who smiled at charity events and held his hand at gallery openings. The woman he proposed to because she seemed to understand loss and loneliness. She'd locked his children in a freezer. But Grace's voice carried the kind of raw terror that couldn't be faked, couldn't be misinterpreted. And underneath Grace's words, Robert could hear something that made his blood turn to ice, the sound of small teeth chattering so hard it was audible through the phone, the desperate, involuntary shivers of a child whose body was fighting hypothermia. Put Emma on the phone, Robert said, and his voice had gone from irritated to something Grace had never heard before, fear so sharp it cut through international phone lines and 7 time zones. Grace held the phone to Emma's ear with gentle hands. The little girl tried to speak but her jaw was shaking too violently, her words coming out fractured and desperate. "DD Daddy, SSOC cold, HH hurts," she said, "we be bad." That's when Robert chin broke. Grace heard it through the phone, the sound of a man's carefully constructed denial shattering into 1,000 irreparable pieces. She heard him moving, shouting for someone named Marcus, his voice rising with each word. "Get the jet ready. Now. I don't care if the crew is sleeping. Wake them up. We leave in 20 minutes. Call ahead to customs, I need clearance on both ends. Just get me home." Then his voice came back to Grace, quieter now but carrying the weight of promises that would either save his family or destroy what was left of it. Keep them warm. Don't call the police yet. I'll be there in 7 hours. Grace, his voice cracked completely. Thank you. Thank you for finding them. If you hadn't. He didn't finish the sentence. They both knew how it ended. The call ended. Grace wrapped both children tighter, carried them to the oversized couch in the staff lounge off the kitchen, the room where employees took breaks, where the world of wealth felt temporarily distant, and held them while their bodies slowly, painfully began to warm. Emma buried her face against Grace's shoulder, her shivers gradually becoming less violent. Tyler's convulsions were easing into normal trembling, his breathing settling into something closer to regular rhythm. But the physical warming was the easy part. Grace could feel the psychological damage in the way Emma flinched at every sound, in the way Tyler kept looking toward the door as if expecting Victoria to return and finish what she'd started. That kind of cold didn't leave just because you added heat. That kind of cold lived in your bones and visited you in nightmares for years afterward. Like and subscribe if you believe some moments change people forever. Because Robert Chen was about to become a different man in the space between one heartbeat and the next. 20 minutes later, footsteps echoed on the stairs. Grace's entire body went rigid, her arms instinctively tightening around the children. But she forced herself to stay still, to not show Emma and Tyler the fear that was coursing through her veins. Victoria appeared in the kitchen doorway, still elegant in her silk dress, still holding a wine glass, her face composed in an expression of mild surprise that was so carefully constructed it bordered on theatrical. "Grace, what are you doing with the children?" Victoria's tone was light, conversational, with just enough concern to sound plausible to anyone who hadn't seen what she was capable of. "They should be in bed by now. It's well past their bedtime." Grace looked up at the woman who'd locked 2 children in a freezer and felt something shift in her chest, the moment when fear transforms into fury, when silence becomes refusal, when the cost of speaking up suddenly matters less than the cost of staying quiet. She pulled Emma and Tyler closer, felt their small bodies pressed against hers, felt Emma's fingers clutching her shirt with the desperate grip of someone who'd learned that safety wasn't guaranteed. "Don't," Grace said quietly, her voice steady even though everything inside her was screaming. "Don't you dare pretend you don't know what you did." Victoria's face flickered, just for a second, the mask slipped and something cold and calculating looked out from behind her carefully made-up eyes. Then she smiled, setting down her wine glass on the marble counter with deliberate, measured care. The sound of crystal touching stone seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet kitchen. "I don't know what stories the children have been telling you, Grace," Victoria said, her voice taking on a tone of patient condescension, "but they were misbehaving. Quite badly, in fact. I simply put them in timeout to think about their actions. If you've traumatized them by overreacting to reasonable discipline. You locked them in a 28-degree freezer for over 2 hours," Grace cut her off, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Look at them. Look at their lips. Look at Emma's face. She can barely speak. Tyler's hands are so cold he still can't feel his fingers. You didn't put them in timeout. You tried to." She couldn't finish the sentence because Emma was listening, because Tyler's traumatized eyes were watching, because naming what Victoria had actually attempted would make it more real than Grace could bear to acknowledge in front of the children who'd survived it. Victoria studied Grace with the kind of cold assessment a person makes when calculating risks and benefits, when weighing consequences against desired outcomes. Her eyes moved from Grace's face to the children's, then to the phone still sitting on the side table. Something shifted in her expression, recognition, perhaps, or the dawning awareness that the situation had escaped her control. She reached for her own phone, pulled it from her designer clutch with manicured fingers, and her voice dropped all pretense of warmth or concern. What emerged was something else entirely, threat wrapped in barely contained rage. "I could have you fired for insubordination," Victoria said softly, each word precisely enunciated. "I could make sure you never work in this state again. One phone call to the right people, Grace. That's all it would take. You're the help. You clean toilets and fold laundry. And you forget your place. You forget who Mr. Chen will believe when I tell him his children's maid has been poisoning them against me for months, turning them into little liars to secure her own position." Grace felt Emma trembling against her, felt Tyler's small hand gripping her sleeve with fingers that were finally starting to warm. She thought about her rent payment due in a week, $1.50 that she barely had saved. She thought about the student loans from nursing school she'd never finished, the debt that followed her like a shadow. She thought about the job market in a recession economy, about the references she'd need that Victoria could destroy with a single well-placed phone call. She thought about all the practical, sensible, survival-based reasons to back down, to apologize, to let the woman with power and money and a massive diamond engagement ring make this entire nightmare disappear. Then she looked at Emma's blue lips and Tyler's traumatized eyes, and she understood with perfect clarity that some choices aren't about practicality or survival. They're about whether you can live with your reflection after you make them. They're about what kind of person you become in the moment when staying silent would be easier and speaking up might cost you everything. "Do what you need to do," Grace said softly, meeting Victoria's cold gaze without flinching. "Fire me. Blacklist me. Destroy my career. I don't care anymore. But you're not touching these children again. Not tonight. Not tomorrow. Not ever. Hit that like button if you know that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing what matters more than fear." Victoria's face went pale, then flushed dark with rage that she no longer bothered to disguise. Her hands shook slightly as she grabbed her wine glass, her phone, her designer clutch. For a moment, Grace thought she might throw the glass, might lunge forward, might do something that would prove conclusively what she was capable of when her carefully constructed image cracked completely. Instead, Victoria smiled, cold and sharp and utterly without humor. "Robert will hear about this. All of it. Every detail. We'll see who he believes when I explain how his paranoid, overprotective maid has been undermining me from the moment I entered this house. You've just destroyed your own life, Grace. I hope 2 ungrateful children were worth your unemployment and ruined reputation." She turned and walked toward the stairs, heels clicking against marble with sharp, angry precision that echoed through the enormous house. Grace heard her climbing to the second floor, heard a door slam with enough force to rattle frames on distant walls, heard drawers opening and closing with increasing violence. Victoria was packing. Running. Erasing herself from a situation that had spiraled beyond her ability to control or manipulate. Emma whispered against Grace's shoulder, her voice still weak but clearer now that warmth was returning, "Is Daddy really coming home?" Grace kissed the top of her head, felt Tyler shift closer, and told them the truth without hesitation. "Yes, baby. Daddy's coming home. And he's going to make sure you're safe. I promise." But what Grace didn't say, what she didn't know yet, was that when Victoria fled upstairs to pack her belongings and escape before Robert's plane could land, she'd left something behind on the kitchen counter. A handwritten note on expensive cream stationery, folded once and placed deliberately beside her abandoned wine glass like evidence at a crime scene. Grace wouldn't find it for another hour, when both children had finally fallen into exhausted, trauma-heavy sleep in her arms and she stood carefully to make them warm honey tea. The note sat there waiting, and the first sentence made Grace's blood turn colder than any freezer ever could. "Robert, by the time you read this, you'll have heard Grace's version of tonight. But what she doesn't know, what nobody knows, is that your children have been manipulating everyone from the beginning, just like their mother manipulated you before she died. I tried to help them. I tried to fix what Catherine broke. But some damage runs too deep, and some children are beyond saving. What happened tonight was their choice, not mine. Ask yourself why Emma knocked over my glass. Ask yourself why Tyler provoked me. Then ask yourself who you really trust, the woman who loves you, or the maid who wants your money and your gratitude. By the time you figure it out, I'll be gone. But don't come looking for me until you're ready to hear the truth about your precious children and the wife who destroyed you long before I arrived. V. Grace's hands shook as she read it twice, 3 times, her mind struggling to process the depth of calculated cruelty contained in those carefully chosen words. This wasn't an apology or an explanation. This was psychological warfare aimed at a grieving man who was already drowning in guilt. This was poison designed to make Robert question everything, his children, his judgment, his dead wife's memory. And Grace understood in that moment that Victoria hadn't just locked 2 children in a freezer tonight. She'd been systematically destroying this family for months, and she'd planned her exit strategy with the same cold precision she'd planned everything else. The question was, would Robert see through it? Or would Victoria's final manipulation work even after she was gone? Robert Chen's private jet cut through darkness at 41,000 feet, racing across the Atlantic while his mind replayed Emma's voice on an endless, torturous loop. "Dee Daddy, SSOC cold." He sat rigid in the leather seat, still wearing the tuxedo from the London gala he'd abandoned without explanation, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had gone white an hour ago. His phone sat on the table in front of him. Screen dark now, call ended, but still carrying the weight of what he'd heard through it. The terror in Grace's voice. The chattering of his daughter's teeth. The impossible words that had shattered his entire understanding of the past 6 months. Victoria locked them in a freezer. The sentence didn't make sense no matter how many times Robert's brain tried to process it. Victoria, who organized charity events and smiled in photographs and talked about her childhood with appropriate amounts of vulnerability. Victoria, who'd held his hand at his wife's grave and promised to help him heal. That Victoria had deliberately, consciously put his children in a 28-degree freezer and walked away. Marcus, his executive assistant who'd been roused from sleep to coordinate this emergency flight, sat across the aisle watching his boss with undisguised concern. In 12 years of working together, he'd never seen Robert like this, completely undone, stripped of the careful composure that usually defined him. "Mr. Chen, we'll be there in 6 hours, Marcus said quietly. "The London office is handled. I've cleared your calendar for the next 2 weeks. Is there anything else?" "I left them," Robert interrupted, his voice hollow. "For 18 months, I left them with strangers and nannies and a woman I barely knew. And tonight they almost died because I wasn't there." Marcus had no answer for that. Because it was true, and they both knew it. Robert pulled out his phone again, opened his photo gallery with shaking hands. The recent photos were all business, board meetings, ribbon cuttings, handshakes with executives whose names he couldn't remember right now. He scrolled back further. 3 months. 6 months. 8 months. Finally, he found them, pictures of Emma and Tyler from before Catherine died. Emma at her 3rd birthday party, frosting on her nose, laughing so hard her eyes had disappeared. Tyler on the beach, building sandcastles with concentration so fierce it was comical. When was the last time he'd seen Emma laugh like that? When was the last time Tyler had looked at him without that careful, guarded expression that children shouldn't need to develop? Robert's phone buzzed. A text from Grace, "Children are asleep. Still shivering in their sleep but stable. I'm staying with them until you arrive. Victoria is gone," left a note. "I saved it for you. Subscribe now if you've ever realized too late what you were losing." Another text came through seconds later, this one just a photo. Grace had sent him a picture of Emma and Tyler curled together on the staff lounge couch, wrapped in blankets, their small faces still pale but peaceful in exhausted sleep. Grace's arm was visible at the edge of the frame, her hand resting protectively on Tyler's shoulder. Robert's vision blurred. He set the phone down before he could do something unforgivable like cry in front of his assistant. But the image burned itself into his memory, his children seeking comfort from the maid because their father had been too broken to give it himself. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, "Mr. Chen, we've been cleared for direct routing. Current ETA is 5:42 a.m. Eastern Time. 5 hours and 17 minutes. That's how long his children would have to wait for him to finally show up when they needed him. Robert did the math he'd been avoiding. If Grace hadn't found them when she did, if she'd left at her usual time, if she hadn't heard that faint thumping sound, his children would be dead right now. And he would have landed in Connecticut to police tape and body bags and a truth that would have destroyed him completely. He owed Grace Williams his children's lives. And he'd barely spoken 10 words to her in the past year beyond instructions about laundry and scheduling. Robert opened his laptop, pulled up his personal files, found Grace's employment records. 28 years old. Hired 12 years ago as a junior housekeeper. Promoted to senior domestic staff 6 years later. Salary, $52,000 annually. Education, 2 years of community college, nursing program, withdrew for financial reasons. Emergency contact, mother, address in Hartford. This woman. This $52,000 a year employee who'd never finished nursing school, had saved his children while he'd been 7 time zones away closing a deal worth $340 million. A deal he couldn't even remember the details of now. A deal that meant absolutely nothing compared to the sound of Emma's teeth chattering through a phone line. Robert closed the laptop and picked up his phone again. He called his lawyer's emergency line. 3 rings, then a groggy voice, "Robert. It's 4 in the morning. What?" "I need you to do 3 things," Robert said, his voice steady for the first time since Grace's call. "First, draft termination paperwork for Victoria Laurent. I want her barred from my property, my businesses, all contact with my children. Second, I need you to research criminal charges for child endangerment and attempted harm. I want everything on my desk by tomorrow afternoon. Third," he paused, calculating. "Set up a trust fund. $250,000. Beneficiary: Grace Williams. She saved my children's lives tonight. Make sure she never has to worry about money again. Like and subscribe if you believe some debts can't be paid but must be acknowledged." His lawyer was fully awake now. "Robert, what happened? Are Emma and Tyler?" "Just do it," Robert interrupted. "I'll explain everything when I land. And one more thing, find out what it costs to finish a nursing degree at whatever school Grace attended. Pay it. Pay all of it. Tuition, books, living expenses. She shouldn't have had to quit." The call ended. Robert stared out the window at darkness broken occasionally by lights from cities below. Somewhere down there, people were sleeping peacefully, their children safe in their beds, their lives untouched by the kind of nightmare he was living through. He envied them with an intensity that felt like physical pain. His phone buzzed again. Another text from Grace, "Mr. Chen, I need to tell you something before you get home." Victoria left a note. She tried to blame the children. "I wanted you to know before you read it so you're prepared. The note is full of lies about Emma and Tyler. Don't believe it. I was there. I saw what she did." Robert's jaw clenched. Of course Victoria would try to manipulate the narrative. Of course she'd attempt to rewrite reality, to make herself the victim and his traumatized children the villains. That's what narcissists did when their masks slipped and the world saw what lived underneath. He texted back with fingers that shook from rage instead of fear, "Grace, I believe you. Not her. Never her. Thank you for protecting them. I'm so sorry you had to." 3 minutes later, Grace responded, "You're their father. You don't need to apologize to me. Just come home and be what they need. That's all that matters now." The simplicity of it hit Robert like a physical blow. Come home and be what they need. Not build them a bigger house. Not buy them more toys. Not hire better staff or more expensive therapists. Just be present. Just be their father instead of a ghost who signed checks and sent gifts from hotel rooms in foreign countries. For 18 months, he'd been running from grief. Tonight, he would run toward his children instead. The flight attendant approached carefully. "Mr. Chen, can I get you anything? Coffee? Water?" "No," Robert said quietly. Then reconsidered. "Actually, yes. Do we have children's books on this plane? Anything appropriate for a 4-year-old and a 5-year-old? The attendant blinked, surprised. I don't think so, sir. We typically only stock business publications and when we land, I need you to find a bookstore. I don't care if you have to wake someone up to open it. Buy 20 children's books. Happy ones. The kind parents read at bedtime." Robert pulled out his wallet, handed her his black card. "And stuffed animals. 2 of them. Soft ones. Whatever looks comforting." Marcus was staring at him now. Robert met his assistant's gaze. "Clear my schedule for the next month, not 2 weeks. Cancel everything. Board meetings, investor calls, the Tokyo trip, all of it. Get someone else to handle it. Sir, the Tokyo deal alone is worth." "I don't care what it's worth," Robert said, and his voice carried the weight of decisions that couldn't be unmade, priorities that had finally, catastrophically shifted. "My children almost froze to death tonight while I was across an ocean closing deals. I'm done. The company will survive without me for a month. My children won't survive without me for much longer. Subscribe if you know that some wake-up calls come at a cost too high to ignore." The plane continued its race across the Atlantic. Below, the ocean stretched dark and infinite. Robert watched the sun begin to rise over the horizon, pink and gold spilling across clouds, beautiful in a way that felt almost obscene given what his children had endured while he'd been absent. He thought about Catherine's last words to him, spoken in those final moments while paramedics worked frantically around them. He'd been so destroyed by grief that he buried the memory, but now it came back with perfect, agonizing clarity. "Robert, promise me, don't disappear on them. They need you, not your money, you." He'd failed that promise for 18 months. He'd given his children everything except the one thing Catherine had begged him to give them, himself. His phone buzzed one final time. Grace had sent another photo. This one showed Emma's hand. Small, pale, with faint red marks on the fingertips from where she'd pounded against the freezer door. The image was devastating in its simplicity. Those tiny fingers had beaten against metal, seeking help, seeking warmth, seeking anyone who would hear them. And Grace had heard them. Grace had saved them. Grace had done what Robert should have been there to do. The plane began its descent toward Teterboro Airport. Dawn was breaking over Connecticut, painting the sky in colors that promised a new day. Robert gathered his things mechanically, his mind focused on a single image, Emma and Tyler asleep on that couch, finally safe, waiting for a father who'd been gone too long. He wouldn't make them wait anymore. The wheels touched down at 5:38 a.m. Robert was out of his seat before the plane had fully stopped taxiing. His car was waiting on the tarmac, engine running. He didn't wait for luggage. He didn't wait for Marcus. He just ran like he should have run 18 months ago when grief first tempted him to disappear. The drive from Teterboro to the Connecticut estate normally took 45 minutes. Robert made it in 28, breaking every speed limit, his heart pounding harder with each mile that brought him closer to home. The sun was fully up now, bright and cold, when he finally pulled through the gates and saw the mansion where his children had almost died. Grace was waiting at the front door. Robert didn't recognize the woman standing in his doorway at first. Grace looked like she'd aged a decade overnight, dark circles carved beneath her eyes, her uniform wrinkled from hours of sitting motionless with sleeping children, her hair pulled back in a hasty knot that had come loose hours ago. But it was her expression that stopped Robert in his tracks. Not relief. Not exhaustion. Something harder and more resolute, the look of someone who'd made peace with consequences they couldn't control. "They're still sleeping," Grace said quietly, stepping aside to let him enter his own home. Emma woke up once around 4, crying. Tyler had nightmares twice but didn't fully wake. Their core temperatures are normal now, but they'll need to see a doctor. And Mr. Chen, she paused, her hand reaching into her pocket. "You need to read this before you see them. Before you make any decisions." She handed him Victoria's note. Robert unfolded the expensive cream stationery with hands that had steadied during the flight but now trembled again. His eyes scanned the first sentence, then the second, and with each word his face transformed from exhaustion to something darker, the kind of cold fury that came from recognizing manipulation too late. "Your children have been manipulating everyone from the beginning, just like their mother manipulated you before she died." He read it twice, his jaw tightening with each poisonous sentence. When he finished, he looked up at Grace, and his voice came out raw. "She's trying to make me doubt them. My own children. After what she did." "I know," Grace said simply. "That's why I wanted you to read it now, when you're clear-headed. Not later when exhaustion makes you vulnerable to her lies. Like and subscribe if you know manipulation doesn't end when the abuser leaves." Robert crumpled the note in his fist, then stopped, smoothed it out again. "The police will need this evidence." He met Grace's eyes. "I'm pressing charges. Every possible charge. She doesn't get to do this and walk away." Grace nodded slowly. "The children might have to testify eventually. Give statements. Are you prepared for that? For what it will do to them?" The question hit Robert like a physical blow because he hadn't thought that far ahead. His mind had been focused solely on getting home, on seeing Emma and Tyler alive, on fixing what Victoria had broken. He hadn't considered the aftermath, the investigations, the interviews, the way the legal system would force his traumatized children to relive their worst night over and over. "What would you do?" Robert asked, and the question wasn't employer to employee. It was one parent asking another for guidance he desperately needed. Grace was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of lived experience. "My father died when I was 9. Cancer. The last 6 months, he was in so much pain he couldn't hide it anymore. After he passed, people kept asking me about it. Teachers, counselors, family friends, everyone wanted me to talk about it, process it, share how I felt. But I just wanted to remember the good parts without having to explain the worst parts to strangers." She looked toward the staff lounge where Emma and Tyler slept. "Those children have been through enough. If you can protect them from reliving it in courtrooms and police stations, I think you should. But if you can't live with Victoria facing no consequences, then you do what you need to do. Just know that the price might be paid by the people you're trying to protect." Robert absorbed this, feeling the impossible weight of choosing between justice and mercy, between accountability and trauma. Before he could respond, a small voice came from the doorway. "Daddy?" Emma stood there in Grace's oversized cardigan, her blonde hair tangled from sleep, her green eyes, Catherine's eyes, wide and uncertain. She looked so small, so fragile, that Robert's heart cracked cleanly down the middle. He dropped to his knees on the marble floor, and his voice broke. "Baby. I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Emma didn't run to him. She stood frozen, studying him with an expression far too cautious for a 4-year-old. "Are you staying? Or leaving again?" The question destroyed him. Because it was the question he deserved, the one his absence had taught her to ask. How many times had she watched him leave? How many promises of, "I'll be back soon," had become days, then weeks, then months of empty rooms and nannies who couldn't replace what she'd lost? "I'm staying," Robert said, and his voice shook with the weight of the promise. "I'm not leaving you again, Emma. Not for work. Not for anything. I'm staying." She took one tentative step forward, then another. Robert stayed on his knees, letting her come to him at her own pace, not rushing her, not assuming he'd earned the right to her trust just by showing up. When she finally reached him, she didn't hug him. She just placed one small hand on his shoulder, testing whether he was real or another dream that would disappear when she woke. "You came home," she whispered, and it sounded like she couldn't quite believe it. "Grace called me. She told me you needed me. I got on a plane as fast as I could." Robert's hand covered hers carefully, afraid she might pull away. "I should have been here already. I should have been here the whole time." Subscribe now, because some moments of truth can't be undone, only honored. Behind Emma, Tyler appeared in the doorway, his red shirt wrinkled from sleep, his face still pale but his eyes alert and wary. At 5 years old, he was already learning to read situations, to assess whether safety was real or temporary. He looked at his father, then at Grace, then back at his father. "Is she gone?" Tyler asked, and Robert didn't need to ask who he meant. "Victoria is gone. She's never coming back. And I'm going to make sure she can't hurt you or anyone else ever again." Robert opened his other arm. "Tyler, come here. Please." Tyler walked over slowly, and when he reached his father, he asked the question that had been weighing on him since his mother died. "Did we make you sad? Is that why you stayed away?" Robert's composure shattered completely. He pulled both children close, carefully, gently, afraid of frightening them but unable to not hold them after coming so close to losing them forever. "No. God, no. You didn't make me sad. Losing your mother made me sad, and I handled it terribly. I ran away from the grief, and I ran away from you because you reminded me of her. But that was my failure. My weakness. Not yours. Never yours." Emma's small hand clutched his shirt. Tyler's arms wrapped tentatively around his neck. They stayed like that on the marble floor, a father and his children finding their way back to each other through words that should have been spoken 18 months ago. Grace watched from the doorway, her own eyes wet, and Robert looked up at her over his children's heads. "Thank you," he mouthed silently, knowing the words were inadequate but needing to say them anyway. Grace nodded once, then quietly stepped back, giving them space for a reunion that was both heartbreaking and necessary. She moved toward the kitchen, intending to make breakfast for children who would need normal routines to feel safe again. But Robert stopped her with his voice. "Grace, wait. Please don't go." She turned back, confusion crossing her features. "You saved their lives," Robert said, his arms still holding Emma and Tyler close. "You did what I should have done. What I failed to do for 18 months. You were more of a parent to them than I was." His voice grew stronger, more certain. "I don't want you to leave. Not now. Not until they're ready." They need you. Grace's expression softened but also firmed with resolve. Mr. Chen, they need their father. Not another substitute. That's what I've been for too long, a stand-in for what they really needed. Then help me learn how to be what they need, Robert said, and the vulnerability in his voice was absolute. I don't know what Emma's favorite breakfast is anymore. I don't know what stories Tyler likes at bedtime. I don't know which nightmares wake them or what words comfort them. You know all of that. Please. Help me learn to be their father again. Emma pulled back slightly to look at Grace, and her small voice carried the wisdom of children who'd learned too young that adults were fallible. Can you stay for breakfast? Please. Tyler added his own plea. We make good pancakes with Grace. We could teach you. Robert looked at his son, this 5-year-old boy who was offering to teach his billionaire father how to make pancakes, and understood that this was the lesson he'd needed all along. Wealth couldn't substitute for presence. Success couldn't replace showing up. And the most important things his children could teach him had nothing to do with business empires and everything to do with ordinary moments like making breakfast together. Like and subscribe if you believe real wealth is measured in presence, not possessions. Grace studied the three of them, this broken family trying to find their way back to wholeness, and made a decision that came from compassion rather than obligation. Okay. I'll stay for breakfast. And maybe for a few days after, until you find your rhythm. But Mr. Chen, you need to understand something. Her voice was gentle but firm. These children don't need a hero who swoops in and fixes everything. They need a father who shows up every single day, even when it's hard. Even when grief makes it feel impossible. Can you be that person? Robert looked at Emma's cautious hope and Tyler's fragile trust, and he made the only promise that mattered. Yes. I'll be that person. Starting right now. He stood, lifting Emma into his arms, reaching for Tyler's hand. Together, the four of them walked toward the kitchen where morning light was spilling through windows, casting ordinary gold across expensive floors. Outside, the world continued its indifferent spin. Inside, a family was beginning the slow, painful, necessary work of healing. So, Robert said, setting Emma on the counter and pulling Tyler close. I hear you two are pancake experts. I should probably warn you, I'm terrible at cooking. But I'm a very good student. Emma giggled, the first genuine sound of joy Robert had heard from her in longer than he could remember. You have to measure the flour exactly right, or they get lumpy. And you can't flip them too early, Tyler added seriously, or they fall apart. Grace moved to the stove, pulling out mixing bowls and ingredients, watching Robert fumble with measuring cups and listening to his children patiently correct his mistakes. It was ordinary and imperfect and exactly what they needed, not grand gestures or expensive gifts, but presence, attention, and the willingness to learn from 4-year-old and 5-year-old teachers. Outside the kitchen window, a police car drove past the gates. Summoned by a neighbor who'd noticed unusual activity at the estate overnight. The real world, with its investigations and consequences and difficult decisions, was waiting. Victoria's note sat on the counter, evidence of manipulation that would need to be addressed. Medical appointments would need to be scheduled. Therapists would need to be consulted. The legal system would demand answers. But for this moment, this single, precious, irreplaceable moment. Robert Chen stood in his kitchen making imperfect pancakes with his children, and for the first time in 18 months, he understood what wealth really meant. The pediatric psychologist's office smelled like vanilla and lavender, designed to be calming, but Emma still gripped Robert's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Dr. Sarah Mitchell had been recommended by 3 different specialists. She worked exclusively with traumatized children, and her approach was gentle but direct. Today was the 3rd session, and the first time Emma had agreed to speak about that night without Tyler present. "You can stay in the waiting room," Emma whispered to her father, her voice barely audible. "I'm okay." Robert's throat tightened. 3 weeks ago, his daughter wouldn't let him out of her sight. Now she was telling him she could do this alone, and he couldn't decide whether to be proud or heartbroken that she'd learned such courage at 4 years old. "I'll be right outside if you need me," Robert promised, kissing the top of her head. "You're the bravest person I know." Through the observation window, one-way glass that Dr. Mitchell used for parental monitoring, Robert watched Emma settle into the small chair across from the psychologist. The room was filled with toys, art supplies, and soft lighting. Nothing threatening. Everything carefully designed to help children process what words couldn't capture. "Emma, last time we talked about safe people," Dr. Mitchell began gently. "The people who make you feel protected. Do you remember who you told me about?" Emma nodded, picking up a stuffed bear from the table. "Grace. And now Daddy." "And now Daddy," Dr. Mitchell repeated, acknowledging the shift. "That's a big change. What made Daddy become a safe person again?" Emma was quiet for a long moment, her small hands squeezing the bear. "He came home. And he didn't leave. Even when I was scared he would." Subscribe if you know trust is rebuilt in moments, not promises. Robert's eyes burned. For 3 weeks, he'd kept his word. No business trips. No late-night calls in his office. No disappearing into work when grief became overwhelming. Every morning he made breakfast with Emma and Tyler. Every afternoon he was present, playing, listening, learning who his children had become. Every night he read bedtime stories until their breathing steadied into sleep. It was the hardest thing he'd ever done. Harder than building a billion-dollar company. Harder than surviving Catherine's death. Because presence required vulnerability that success had never demanded from him. Dr. Mitchell handed Emma some crayons and paper. "Can you draw what scared you most about that night?" Emma's hand hesitated over the colors, then selected black and blue. Robert watched through the glass as his daughter drew a rectangle, the freezer door, he realized with a jolt of pain. Then 2 small circles inside. Herself and Tyler. "It was dark," Emma said softly. "And cold. And nobody heard us. We called and called but nobody came. Until Grace came," Dr. Mitchell reminded gently. "Until Grace," Emma agreed. "She always hears us." In the waiting room, Grace sat beside Tyler, who was building a tower from wooden blocks with focused intensity. She'd stayed for 3 days as promised, then continued staying because leaving felt impossible. Robert had offered her a new position, not as a maid, but as a family assistant with triple her previous salary and flexible hours so she could finish her nursing degree. She'd accepted, not for the money, but because Emma still asked for her every night, and Tyler still needed her steady presence to feel safe. Robert stepped away from the observation window and joined them. Tyler looked up, his construction temporarily abandoned. "Is Emma okay?" Tyler asked with the worry of an older sibling who'd learned too young that bad things could happen. "She's very okay," Robert assured him. "She's talking to Dr. Mitchell about brave things." Like and subscribe, sometimes the bravest thing is letting yourself heal. Tyler considered this, then returned to his blocks. But he moved closer to Robert's chair, close enough that their shoulders touched. These small gestures. The unconscious seeking of proximity, the testing of whether his father would still be there when he looked up, Robert had learned to recognize them as the language of rebuilding trust. Grace met Robert's eyes over Tyler's head. In 3 weeks, they'd developed a partnership built on shared purpose. She taught him the rhythms of his children's days. He learned to read their silences, their subtle withdrawals, the moments when they needed space versus the moments they needed arms around them. The office door opened. Emma emerged with Dr. Mitchell, her face thoughtful but not distressed. She went straight to Robert, climbed into his lap without hesitation, another small miracle of progress. "Mr. Chen, could I speak with you for a moment?" Dr. Mitchell gestured toward her office. Robert settled Emma with Grace and Tyler, then followed the psychologist inside. She closed the door, her expression serious but not alarmed. "Emma is processing the trauma remarkably well, given the severity of what she experienced," Dr. Mitchell began. "But she told me something today that concerns me. She said Victoria visited her dreams last night and told her the freezer was her fault for being clumsy." Robert's blood went cold. "Victoria is in custody. She can't." "Not literally," Dr. Mitchell interrupted gently. "But trauma creates intrusive thoughts that sound like the abuser's voice. Emma is internalizing Victoria's manipulation. She believes, on some level, that she caused what happened by knocking over that glass. Hit that like button if you understand that wounds outlast the people who caused them." Robert's hands clenched into fists. "How do I fix that? How do I make her understand none of it was her fault?" "You keep doing exactly what you're doing," Dr. Mitchell said firmly. "You stay present. You stay consistent. And when she has those thoughts, you gently remind her of the truth. Healing isn't linear, Mr. Chen. Some days will be harder than others. But Emma has something now she didn't have 3 weeks ago." "What's that?" "A father who shows up. That's more powerful than any therapy I can provide." Robert absorbed this, feeling the weight of responsibility shift from burden to purpose. He thought about the business empire he'd built, the deals he'd closed, the success he'd accumulated. None of it mattered compared to this, being present for a 4-year-old who needed to believe the world could be safe again. When he returned to the waiting room, Emma reached for his hand immediately. "Can we go home now?" she asked. "Yes, baby. Let's go home." And for the first time in 18 months, home felt like the place Robert wanted to be most. The modest colonial house on Maple Street didn't have a gate or security cameras or marble floors that echoed with emptiness. It had a porch swing that creaked when Emma pushed it with her feet. It had a backyard where Tyler's soccer ball left worn patches in the grass. It had a kitchen table scarred from years of use that Robert had purchased from an estate sale, choosing character over perfection for the first time in his life. Robert stood at that table now, packing lunches for his children's first day back at their new school. Peanut butter and jelly for Emma, crusts cut off, the way she liked it. Turkey and cheese for Tyler, with extra pickles. He'd learned these details slowly, through trial and error, through paying attention to what they ate and what they left behind. "Daddy, can you braid my hair?" Emma appeared in the doorway, already dressed in her new school uniform, her blonde hair brushed but tangled at the ends. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have asked him. She would have sought Grace, or suffered through the tangles herself, not trusting that her father knew how to do such ordinary, necessary things. But Robert had learned. He'd watched YouTube videos at midnight, practiced on Grace's patient instruction, fumbled through dozens of attempts until his fingers understood the pattern. "Come here, baby." Robert pulled out a chair, and Emma climbed up, settling between his knees. His hands moved through her hair with careful precision, gathering sections, crossing them over, weaving the braid that would hold through a full day of playground adventures and classroom learning. Subscribe if you believe the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight. "Are you nervous about today?" Robert asked softly, his fingers working steadily. Emma was quiet for a moment, and Robert had learned that her silences meant she was choosing words carefully, not that she had nothing to say. "A little. But Tyler will be there. And you'll pick us up after, right? Right at 3 o'clock. I'll be the one waiting by the flagpole. Promise? Promise." The braid finished, Robert secured it with the elastic band Emma handed him. She touched it experimentally, then turned to hug him. Quick and fierce, the way she did now when emotions overwhelmed her capacity for words. Tyler thundered down the stairs, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders. At 5.5, he was already showing signs of the person he'd become, thoughtful, protective, gentle despite everything he'd survived. He stopped at the bottom step, studying his father with an expression Robert had learned to read. "What's on your mind?" Robert asked. "Is Grace coming to dinner tonight?" Tyler's voice carried hope mixed with uncertainty, the lingering fear that people he loved might disappear without warning. "She is. She's bringing her famous mac and cheese." Robert smiled, pulling Tyler close. "She'll want to hear all about your first day. Grace had finished her nursing degree 2 months ago. She worked 3 days a week at the children's hospital downtown, spent the other days with her own family, and visited Robert's home twice weekly for dinners that had become tradition. She was no longer an employee but something more complicated and more valuable, chosen family, the person who'd bridged the gap between who Robert had been and who he needed to become. The Connecticut estate had sold within a month. Robert kept enough wealth to ensure his children's futures but donated the majority to organizations supporting traumatized children and domestic violence survivors. The business empire was managed by capable executives who no longer required his constant oversight. He consulted, advised, attended occasional board meetings, but his primary occupation now was father, and he guarded those hours fiercely. Victoria's trial had concluded 3 weeks ago. 8 years for child endangerment, assault, and a pattern of abuse that investigators had traced back through 2 previous families she'd infiltrated and destroyed. Robert had testified, his voice steady as he described the night Grace found his children with blue lips and frozen fingers. Emma and Tyler hadn't been required to appear, protected by their ages and a judge who understood that justice shouldn't compound trauma. The day the verdict was announced, Robert had sat with his children in their small backyard, and Emma had asked the question he'd been dreading, "Does this mean we're safe now?" Robert had pulled both children close, smelling the sunshine in their hair, feeling the warm weight of their bodies against his, and told them the truth. "Victoria can't hurt you anymore. She's going away for a very long time. But safety isn't just about her being gone. It's about knowing that no matter what happens, I'm here. And I'm not leaving. Ever." Tyler had considered this seriously. "Even when you're sad about Mama?" "Even then. Especially then." That conversation had happened beside the tomato plants Tyler had helped him cultivate, small green fruits just beginning to ripen, proof that growth was possible even in damaged soil. Now, standing in their kitchen with school lunches packed and children ready for new beginnings, Robert felt something he hadn't experienced in 2 years, peace. Not the absence of pain, because grief still visited him on quiet nights when Emma's laugh sounded too much like Catherine's, or when Tyler's expressions mirrored his mother's in ways that stole Robert's breath. But peace that came from showing up, from being present, from choosing his children every single day even when every single day felt impossible. Like and subscribe if you know that redemption isn't found, it's built, one small choice at a time. The drive to school was short, 12 minutes through tree-lined streets where neighbors waved and children walked together in small clusters. Robert pulled into the drop-off line, watching Emma's fingers twist nervously in her lap. Tyler reached over and squeezed her hand, a gesture so unconsciously protective it made Robert's heart ache with pride. "You've got this," Tyler told his sister with the confidence of someone who'd survived darkness and emerged believing in light again. Emma nodded, gathering her backpack, her courage. When they reached the school entrance, she turned back one final time, and Robert saw it clearly. The girl she was becoming, shaped by trauma but not defined by it, learning to trust the world again because her father had learned to be trustworthy. "Love you, Daddy," Emma called, and the words carried weight they'd never had before. "Love you both," Robert responded, his voice steady despite the emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "I'll be here at 3. Right by the flagpole." He watched them disappear through the doors. His children, holding hands, walking into a future he'd almost destroyed through absence but was fighting to rebuild through presence. The old Robert would have driven straight to his office, buried himself in work, used productivity as armor against feeling. The new Robert drove to the park, sat on a bench overlooking the playground where he'd brought Emma and Tyler last weekend, and let himself feel everything. The grief that never fully left, the gratitude that Grace had heard that sound in the freezer, the terrifying responsibility of being the person his children needed him to be. His phone buzzed. A text from Grace: "First day jitters are normal. For the kids and for you. You're doing great. See you at dinner." Robert smiled, pocketed his phone, and stayed on that bench until the sun climbed higher and the morning's anxiety settled into something manageable. At 2:45, he drove back to the school, parked, and walked to the flagpole to wait. Other parents gathered around him, mothers and fathers engaged in casual conversation about carpools and soccer schedules and the ordinary challenges of raising children in an ordinary world. Robert joined their conversation, comfortable in his ordinariness in a way he'd never been comfortable in his wealth. At exactly 3 o'clock, the doors opened, and children poured out like water from a broken dam. Robert scanned the crowd until he found them, Emma and Tyler, walking together, their faces lit with the particular joy of surviving something nerve-wracking and discovering it wasn't so terrible after all. Emma ran toward him, her braids slightly loosened from the day's adventures, her eyes bright. "Daddy, I made a friend. Her name is Sophie and she likes unicorns too." Tyler followed at a more measured pace but with equal enthusiasm. "My teacher said I'm really good at math. Can I show you what we learned?" Robert knelt on the sidewalk, gathered both children into his arms, and understood with perfect clarity that this ordinary moment of reuniting after an ordinary day at an ordinary school, was the wealth he'd been chasing all along. Not the billions in his accounts or the empire bearing his name, but the simple, irreplaceable privilege of being present when his children needed him to be. They walked to the car together, Emma chattering about Sophie and unicorns, Tyler explaining the complexities of addition with the seriousness of someone who'd discovered a great mystery. Robert listened to every word, asked questions, remembered details, stored away this moment alongside all the others he was finally present to collect. The house on Maple Street welcomed them home with creaking floors and comfortable furniture and photographs on the refrigerator held by magnets Emma had chosen. Grace arrived at 6 with mac and cheese and stories from the hospital. They ate together at the scarred kitchen table, and when dinner ended, Robert read bedtime stories until both children's breathing steadied into sleep. Then he sat on the porch swing as evening settled into night, listening to crickets and distant traffic, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while he'd been lost in thought. The old mansion was someone else's now, some other family's marble floors and echoing rooms. This small house with its creaking swing and worn grass was home, and Robert wouldn't trade it for anything. His phone buzzed one final time. A message from his lawyer: Victoria's appeal was denied. The sentence stands. It's truly over. Robert deleted the message. It wasn't over, healing never truly ended, and his children would carry scars from that night for the rest of their lives. But they were building something stronger than the pain. A family reconstructed from broken pieces, held together not by wealth or perfection but by presence, by showing up, by choosing each other every single day. And that, Robert understood now, was the only wealth that had ever mattered.